This is TWiT.
And so you also you write about some of the people that we have heard of. Tony Fadell, you spoke to. Scott Forestall, you didn't speak to. I'm wondering, Scott Forestall doesn't work for Apple anymore. Like, I think I'm not sure what he does. I know he was on writing plays on Broadway for a while. But any ideas why Forestall wouldn't talk to you at this point?
I don't know. We actually did speak on background.
But off the record.
I think it's off record. I think it's okay for me to say that now. I think honestly, it was part of it was just that there is still that sort of legacy of secrecy that does have sort of this effect. And he did, come forward and sit down with the Computer History Museum, and he's done a couple things. So, part of it was just maybe the timing. He wasn't quite right. He wasn't quite ready to tell the story, or, I don't know. I can't really speculate. But I will say that, his sort of direct lieutenants, Henri Lamoureux, Richard Williamson, Nitin Ganatra, the people who worked with him every day, they all did come forward, sometimes for the first time. Richard and Henri had shared fascinating stories about the development that I had never heard before, and they could talk a lot about Scott and his sort of character as a leader, which many people both admired. And, it was kind of shades of Steve Jobs, right? And that's the classic thing you hear about Scott Forstall's management style, is that it was also very intense, very demanding, but a lot of people really respected him too.
Mm-hmm. And so talk a little bit about the drama between Forestall and Tony Fadell and in the development of the iPhone. That's part of what's fascinating in the book.
Yeah. Well, I think it was becoming clear when it became clear at some point early on during the development when they were going to do a phone. I think that when Apple does a new product, Apple doesn't really, do anything half speed. So it was probably clear to a lot of the executive staff and a lot of the management staff that it was going to be a big deal, that it was going to be a big undertaking, and there's going to be a lot of prestige perhaps involved that was at stake. So Scott Forestall, who was had come to lead the Mac software group, saw this as an opportunity to sort of do something new and something interesting. So he kind of got involved with they called themselves the Next Mafia. They were a bunch of software geniuses, really, like Henri Lamoureux and Richard Williamson, which I just said, that had come over from the Next days, that had been with Steve for over a decade at that point. And they really were sort of championing this Mac OS looking sort of rich, you have a computer in your pocket sort of approach. And Tony Fadell, meanwhile, had already proven himself very, very successful by bringing the iPod to prominence. And he had been doing portable music player stuff for a long time when he came to Apple. He really sort of marshaled his team and sort of brought the iPod from basically a sort of a really, really niche product to convincing Steve to do iTunes on Windows, which kind of blew it up. And he really kind of his star was rising really fast, and it was really high already by the time that the iPhone began development. So it was sort of, they both wanted to, own the product, the project. They both wanted to work on this thing. They both wanted to own it, as the engineers kept telling me. So naturally, it kind of put them at odds. And there was a point in the development process where nobody was sure whether or not they should pursue the means of trying to do a phone by doing this crazy Mac-based sort of system, a system based on Mac OS with a touch screen. It had originally been designed to be a tablet. It had been sort of wound through the development halls at Apple, and it had wound up as this like sort of experimental project that was big. The prototypes were bulky. It had no battery life. It was kind of still miles away from realization. Or, you know, should they do a phone by adapting the iPod? Should they stick a radio in the iPod? They could use it as a stopgap, or if they could get the thing to work well enough, maybe that would be enough. Because at the time, the real fear among Apple's sort of executive class, and what ultimately kind of convinced Steve to do a phone, was the fact that the business proposition for doing a cell phone was almost becoming an imperative, because iPod was their big moneymaker, but cell phones were getting so smart that they could start storing enough MP3s to do both. And if Apple wasn't careful, you know, even if the cell phones were lame looking and not as cool as an iPod, a lot of people would probably just figure, oh, I could stick my MP3s on this phone, then I don't have to carry around two gadgets everywhere. So that's ultimately what sort of pushed Steve's hand. And he was convinced by Mike Bell, one of his executives, who wrote this lengthy email that's now kind of famous in the annals of iPhone lore, and really said, Steve, look, we got to do this. And then he had these two choices: iPod phone, shrink this crazy, exciting touchscreen-based thing. So they really tried both. And since Tony was in charge of the iPod phone and Scott was in charge of the software project, they ended up sort of being at odds, because it was kind of framed like a bake-off. And it did sort of lead to some tensions and political strife within Apple.